Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Scrutiny Management Panel meeting. I'm Councillor Matthew Atkins, Chair of the panel. Just before we begin, I'd like to draw your attention to the following housekeeping information. So, safety information: if the continuous fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the room and public gallery by the stairwells. Do not attempt to use the lifts. Please assemble at Queen Victoria's statue in front of the civic offices. In order to comply with fire marshal regulations, if you've signed into the Guildhall, please sign out as you leave the building after today's meeting. Can I also draw everyone's attention to the fact this meeting is live streamed from a camera at a fixed location at the back of the meeting room, and the recording is on the Council's website. The camera will mainly capture the backs of anyone making deputations. There is some footage as they approach and leave the table. Members of the public are permitted to record the meeting on the understanding that it neither disrupts the meeting nor records those stating explicitly they do not wish to be recorded. Can I ask everyone to use the microphone provided when they are speaking? Can I ask members and officers to introduce themselves? We'll start on my left and go around the room. So we'll start with you, Chris.
Chris Ward, Director of Finance for the Council.
James Harris, Senior Local Democracy Officer.
Dave Ashbourne, one of the councillors for Fratton.
Councillor Graham Heaney, Labour Councillor for St Jude Ward.
Councillor Mark Jeffrey for St Thomas Ward.
Liam Madden, Councillor Nelson Ward.
Thank you very much. I have apologies for absence from Councillor Abdul Kadir, and also Councillor Scott Pater Harris has communicated to me that he's stuck at work. He may get here for the end, but it's quite unlikely at this point, so he sends his apologies. And Councillor Gemma New, I believe, is dealing with a family emergency, and so also will not be making it today. So, right. If we can now move on to declarations of interest, do members of the committee have any interest to declare? Nope. Excellent. Moving on now to the minutes of the last Scrutiny Management Panel held on the 16th of January 2023. Are members happy with the minutes as a correct record? I'll just sort of leaf through the pages. If you have any comments, please indicate. So any comments on page 1? Any comments on page 2? Page 3? Page 4? Page 5? Or page 6?
Chair.
Yep.
Page 6.
Yep.
Just the penultimate paragraph there, just that the panel requested an update on the EDCL, whatever the hell it's called, into Portsmouth International Port. It's vague, isn't it? I mean, will we be having an update on that prior to Purdah taking place?
That's a good point. From my recollection of the meeting, I don't believe that they were immediately carrying on with the review into the international port, but rather were going to proceed with the other topics that were suggested for the EDCL panel.
Chair, can I clarify? I think I might be able to assist. I think this was to just follow up on the recommendations from the review that actually came prior to COVID. And the question is whether the intervening period had made some of those recommendations redundant, or that they just proceed as normal. It was just a question of seeing what the recommendations had been followed up on, really. That was all it was, as far as I understand it, because we did that with the other ones as well.
Chair, I'd be happy to see a written update if that's better.
So we think that we asked the EDCL panel to provide us with a written update on the recommendations, or the cabinet, or I don't recall if we reached a resolution on anything of that nature. Do others recall what we actually decided in relation to that review?
I had a copy of the recommendations of the review, which had been in 2019, and as we were going through various scrutiny committees looking at what had been recommended and what the cabinet agreed, the idea was to ask the port, have they actually done all of these, or had some of them now been redundant, or overtaken by events or whatever. That was really the gist of it. So it could be easily be done by a written response. It doesn't need a meeting necessarily.
So we could say that we request a written response. I'm not sure we did that at the meeting, so I don't know if that's something to change the minutes or something we should actually now decide in this meeting, in which case do we want to change the minutes, and if so, what, 2 of the previous meeting? Is there something that we think was decided at that was not represented? Did we decide that we would consider it at a future scrutiny panel meeting? Is that what we decided?
No, Chair. I think Graham's put it in a nutshell, hasn't he? The review's taken place, and it's just for us to know what, if anything, happened to the recommendations therein, which is something we would expect to see happening. I.e., coming back, we made these recommendations, or panels made the recommendations, and I'm not sure, I don't know if Graham sits on the Economic Development one, or whether in fact they've had a report back, but I would doubt that very much. So it's just a technical bit in a way, getting an update and how we get that update. And I say a written one would do me, Chair, if that's what people want. But I think that's all it is. It's just find out recommendations were made by a panel. I don't know if they came here or not. And it's just to find out whether they've been implemented, and if not, why they haven't been implemented, or what reasons, or whatever.
Yeah, so the minute records that we've requested a review, would you like it to say that the panel requested an update on the implementation of the recommendations of the review into Portsmouth?
No, Chair, are you reading the same one as me?
I'm asking, yes, the penultimate paragraph, what do you want it changed to?
No, it says there, request an update.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we're happy with the minute as it stands? Yes? Yeah? Okay. But we do, yeah, so we're happy with the minute, but we can put on record today that we would accept that in written form, or do we want to consider it in person in future? I would quite happily consider it in person in future if we have time that it may not happen this. Well, we could schedule that in for March if we wanted. Yeah. I think leave the minute as it stands then, and we'll consider after the meeting if we want to do it in person or in written form. Any other comments on the minutes?
Can I just add a brief comment on the final paragraph to say that I have had a meeting with James to discuss the systems thinking approach, and he's going to put something together as a brief for both of us to consider whether we want to see it for a future scrutiny management panel.
Excellent. Thank you. Right. Can I then say that the minutes are approved? Excellent. Thank you very much. Now moving on to agenda item 4. Overview of Portsmouth City Council budget and council tax for 2023-24 and medium-term budget forecast. I'll hand over to Chris Ward to provide us with an overview.
Thank you, Chair. Excuse me. So this is your opportunity, obviously, to scrutinise the budget, make any recommendations that you would like to Cabinet, that will be considering this on the 21st of February. Following Cabinet's consideration, it will also then be considered by full council on the 28th of February. So if I take you through, I'll take you through the headlines and the meat of the administration's budget proposal, and obviously if you have any questions, we can save those until the end. If anybody wants to interrupt as I go through to ask any burning questions, then obviously I'm happy to take those through you, Chair. So if I just jump straight to the headlines of the report, so the key things that you will be asked to consider, and also the key things that you will be asked to decide upon at the full council meeting. I set that in a little bit of context in the body of the report, but the context is how the overall financial environment changed really rapidly in the current financial year, and how the councillors had to, or the administration in their budget proposals have sought to respond to that. So just by way of context, and you'll hear me repeat this as we go through the presentation itself, you'll probably be aware, because I did give a all members presentation at the back end of last calendar year, to describe how the impact of inflation in particular, and also how that had impacted on demand pressures and demand for council services at the front door, had led the council to a position where it effectively had a budget gap of about £24 million. Now, this was before we knew the outcome of the autumn statement and the local government settlement, which then filters down any funding that's announced in the autumn statement down to a council level. But that's part of the context and part of the history of last year. In response to that, and it will be described as we go through, the administration have made savings proposals for next financial year of £2 million. They are also making proposals to increase council tax by 4.99%, and that's the maximum that's allowed. And that 4.99% includes a 2% council tax increase specifically for adult social care. And if that is implemented, then obviously the funding that's raised by that goes direct to adult social care for their services. The budget proposals also propose that there's a £61.3 million worth of new capital investment next year. Now, some of that is not council funding. 15.3 million of that is council funding. The rest is additional funding that's levered in as a consequence of the administration putting forward £15.3 million worth of capital resources to fund new capital investment. And we then look to the future and ask ourselves, what do we think our 3-year forward projection would look like, our 3-year forward forecast? And the headlines in this report are effectively that as a consequence of the proposals that will be put before Cabinet and Council, the trajectory that the Council was on prior to all of the additional inflationary costs that the Council experienced during the year is back to the point where the Council ought to be in financial balance over the following 3-year period. That 3-year period is next year and the further 3 years beyond that. That said, there are considerable variables within that forecast and risks and assumptions that I'll describe as we go through. So I make the comment that that forecast could vary by plus or minus £5 million. Are sufficiently confident, although said this last year as well, that for the financial year 24-25, so a year ahead of this year, that no corporate savings would be required to balance the budget, but obviously risks which we'll go through. So just some context and a little bit of repetition of what I've just said, but worthy of note that since we always use the reference year 2011-12 because that's the time that, if you remember, that was the time that austerity started. Not that we're necessarily in a austerity program now, but we are in a continued period where financial pressures, particularly in our care services, have weighed heavily on the Council's overall financial position. So since 2011-12, the Council has actually made savings of £106 million. And if we looked at the Council's controllable budget way back, and we looked at it in 2011-12, that would now represent about 49% of our controllable spending. So not an insignificant level of savings that the Council has found. When we talk about savings, that's not necessarily cuts. Savings can come in 3 categories. They could either be efficiency savings, so it's reduced cost but broadly at least same level of service. It could be additional income, which for this Council has been a significant part of that £106 million, or it could be service reductions. Also, contextually it's important to understand that in terms of the Council's controllable spending, over 50% and approaching 60% is on adults and children's social care. So they're the Council's, obviously the Council's statutory services that relate primarily to the vulnerable residents that we have, but equally, we have other statutory services elsewhere across the council in relation to housing, in relation to waste, in relation to education, in relation to other activities of the council. But they are by far the largest consumers of the council's overall spending or funding. In terms of council tax, this council is a low taxing authority. If we compare ourselves to our statistical neighbours, so not just any council or any council that's close to Portsmouth, but if we look at our statistical neighbours, who are those neighbours that have the most similar characteristics as Portsmouth, then the council taxes 9.1% less than the average of our statistical neighbours. In council tax income terms, if the council taxed at the average of our statistical neighbours, council tax would be £9 million higher than it is today. The council also has what's described as a low tax base, which basically means that most of our properties are in bands A, B and C, so those properties that pay the least amount of council tax relative to obviously properties that are in higher tax bands. So the majority of the council's council tax comes from properties in bands A, B and C, which is why we say that the council's average council tax band is band B. Whenever you hear anything that's quoted nationally, government use band D. So it's just important to understand that we have got a significantly different profile than the national, than the average that's used by the government. Put the two things.
It's still 80% of homes in A to C, because it used to be the figure some while ago.
Yes,
is that
it
still
is.
saying
Yeah,
that?
that's right. Put those two things together, obviously, and therefore the level of council tax that the council receives is relatively low compared to other local authorities. Now, what you should have, naturally, in the whole local government funding system is if you have a low council tax and therefore low ability to raise income from your own locality, you should therefore attract more grant funding from government in order to try to balance up the overall funding available to councils so that there's relative equity in terms of the services that are provided across all councils in the country. As we know, it doesn't always work out like that, and you'd have to have some kind of perfect mathematical formula to be able to mimic what happens across every local authority. Over the past year, and it happened pretty rapidly after the council's budget was set back in February 22, we entered this environment of very, very high rising costs, high inflation. And in October just gone, the country experienced levels of inflation that it hadn't experienced for 40 years. Obviously, that hits every part of the economy and it hits council residents at the same time. Excuse me. And when the budget was set last year, obviously we were assuming relatively normal levels of inflation, and we were basing our information on the best estimates of the Office of Budget Responsibility, the Bank of England, so that we were basing it on the foremost forecasters at the time. COVID continues to have an impact on our budget, and as you'll have read in the budget report, if you've got that far, there's no more COVID funding coming from government, but we still experience the legacy of COVID. Much of that is experienced in children's social care. Some is experienced on the commercial ferry port in terms of lower than pre-COVID income levels. And as you would expect, and as is common each year, most of the council's financial pressures are in our essential care services. So the challenge for the budget for next financial year has largely been dominated by high levels of inflation in the current year that flow into next year too, higher levels of demand than we would otherwise have experienced, and still the ongoing legacy of COVID.
Chris, could I just clarify on that?
Sure.
Sorry for you, but on the COVID, are you saying that all the monies that we were entitled to, or thought we were entitled to, or claimed for, or whatever, in relation to COVID, will not be paid by government?
Yeah, so the funding for, there was no more funding for COVID in the current year either. So the last time we received funding for proper funding for COVID was the previous year. And we received it in two ways. One, for our extra costs, and government were providing funding. And secondly, for the losses of income that were experienced mainly as a consequence of lockdowns. So yeah, so that the funding from government ended over a year ago. But we still have legacy impacts. So, for example, and you may have seen it in the budget report, we employed additional social workers to contend with the numbers of children in need presenting at the front door. We've now embedded those additional social workers within the council's budget, and they will continue because we haven't seen the demand drop off. And I've already mentioned the continuing reduction in income levels from the commercial port, and also prior to COVID there were a number of savings planned in children's social care that have been delayed as a consequence of having to deal with COVID and the ongoing demands associated with those that arose in COVID that haven't fallen back to pre-COVID levels. So as you would expect, and I present this as part of the budget report, you would expect the council, if it has a financial challenge, it also ought to have a financial strategy to deal with that. So our strategy for some time, which has endured, is one which says that in-year expenditure ought to match our in-year income or in-year funding. So that basically means that you live within your means, but there is a focus around the overall financial strategy that also says, but whilst doing that, we ought to still have a focus on regeneration, innovation, creativity, protecting the most important and valued services. Some of that focus is to improve the overall funding base of the council, both in terms of trying to leverage additional council tax or additional business rates, which enables you to obviously provide funding for sustaining council services. So as you've heard me say, let me just go back. As you've heard me say, our forecast is that we believe that we have structural balance over the next 3 years. Now, when I talk about structural budget balance, that's when I say that our in-year funding equals our in-year spending, and it strips out any one-offs. So, and it also means, therefore, that you don't need to draw on your reserves in order to balance up your spending with your funding. So the aim, obviously, is to maintain that position. And this is what it would look like. Obviously, to maintain a zero position means that you don't need to make any savings in future years. But as you'll hear me talk about later in the presentation, that forecast could change by plus or minus 5 million. If it did change, say, by 5 million, then that would mean, for example, as we move into 24-25, there would be a savings requirement of 1/3 of that 5 million, because what we'd be suggesting is that 5 million imbalance would happen by the time you get to year 26-27. The council has always had a strategy to smooth out any savings that it needs to find, so you would seek to evenly make that 5 million over a 3-year period in 3 tranches of 1.67 million. Importantly, and again I'll talk about this as we go through, that from 25-26 there's going to be an overhaul of the local government funding system, and there are particular uncertainties and risks associated with what council funding might be from 25-26 onwards. I'll talk about that more as we go through. You've probably heard me talk about it in the past, but what's happening now is that that overhaul has been delayed a couple of years, and actually won't take place until the next Parliament, and obviously it will be a new Parliament that seeks to implement that. So if we turn back to the budget report itself and we start with the current year, so obviously as part of the exercise to present the budget proposal to the Council, we revise the current year's budget and we revise it in the light of any changes that are required, and then there's the proposal for next year's budget following that. So in the current year, if you've been following what's been happening and the reporting that Cabinet have received in terms of this year's budget, you will have seen the impact of some of that inflation that I mentioned earlier on coming through. So the larger variances that have been experienced in the current year, and as I say, most of these are inflation stroke demand related. The pay award is £3.8 million more than was budgeted for. Energy cost inflation was £3.6 million more than budgeted. We're still, as I mentioned earlier, we're still feeling the impact of COVID, and that's a draw on the Council's funding of £2.9 million. Portico is £2.4 million away from its target. Children, families and education, and this is largely relating to home to school transport and the cost of placements, 1.7 million over budget. Adult social care, domiciliary and nursing care packages in the main, 1.2 million over budget. The temporary accommodation costs in the city because of people presenting as homeless, 0.4 million over budget. And there is a revenue contribution to capital in the revised budget in order to provide the required funding for the capital investment proposals that I'll come to later. Some good news. There is some good news associated with rising interest rates. It's bad news for mortgage payers, of course. It's good news for savers. It's good news for the Council's investments because the interest earned on Council investments has led to an additional income over budget of 3.8 million. Now, there's obviously a very big deficit between all of those overspends and the additional income from investments. But that overall overspend, and as we've reported all the way through the year, can be accommodated by the Council's overall contingency. Some of these were risks that were anticipated might occur throughout the year and therefore deliberately set aside as part of the Council's overall corporate contingency. Some of them were not, of course, but overall the proposal for the revised budget is still a revised budget that is in balance because it's drawing on the Council's contingency, and it is not requiring any further draw on the Council's general reserves in order to achieve balance. So that takes us through the revised budget, or the current year's budget, and makes all necessary changes to keep it in balance. If we move now to the budget proposals for next year, and this obviously will be a key focus of the Council meeting on the 28th. If I start actually with the budget consultation, and you'll be aware that any strategy should be cognizant of any consultation that takes place. So budget consultation was run towards the back end of last calendar year. It asked a number of questions. Its focus was on what should the Council do in terms of council tax. Should it increase council tax, and if so, by how much? Should it increase council tax specifically to be able to provide additional funding for adult social care, and if so, by how much? It also seeks to ask residents what their priorities are in terms of the services that the Council provides, and it also seeks to ask residents what their priorities would be for any new capital investments. So you can see these are the key things that the Council will be determining on the 28th of February. So I'll run through some of these points. 79% of respondents support an increase in council tax. Just generally, that's a binary question. Would you support an increase in council tax or not? So the majority do. The most popular response was a 3% increase. Now, that's a 3% increase for general purposes, as distinct from what should be provided for adult social care. I'll come to it later. 3% is the maximum. So that's the maximum allowed by the government before you have to hold a referendum. Then residents were also asked about a further council tax increase for adult social care. And again, 76% of respondents said that they would be in favour of an increase for adult social care, and the majority of those said that they would support a 2% increase. So I think obviously what you're seeing is that there's a majority support for an overall 5% increase in council tax. In terms of service priorities, these have ordered slightly differently from last year, which is quite interesting. Similar questions were asked last year, and I think the highest scoring service priority last year was collecting the bins and keeping the city clean. That's now dropped to, feels like the music charts, doesn't it? That's now dropped to number 2 in the charts, and number 1, which I think was number 2, ensuring older people and vulnerable adults are looked after and supported to live independently, becomes number 1. And number 3, keeping children safe and families together. In terms of capital investment, it's number 1. There's 4 on here actually. Number 1 is new homes in the city, particularly for elderly residents offering care. More classrooms, specialist provision for children with special educational needs. Improving the facilities at the port to generate money to protect local services. Excuse me. And better facilities for sustainable transport, cycling and walking. So obviously to hold that in the back of your mind as you consider the proposals that are put forward to you for your consideration. If we now look at what the settlement was, because obviously the level of funding determines the level of spending. You can't spend more than you've got. So I hope you can see that. So the first part of funding that we touch on is the local government settlement. So how much grant is provided to government for next year and what are the changes? So there's been an overall increase in government funding of £6.4 million, but that comes in 2 broad categories. Category 1 is the increases that they've provided for social care. Now that's both adults and children's, and that actually amounts to 7.9 million. So what's happened in reality is that there's been a reduction in grant for all other services. So all other services have experienced a £1.5, in terms of grant funding, a £1.5 million reduction. Now don't confuse that with what the council does in its budget, because that's not £1.5 million worth of cuts past council services. This is just £1.5 million less funding for the council, which is intended for other services. And if you consider that in the context that inflation, and the measure that government tend to use in inflation is the CPI in September. CPI in September was 10.1%. So in the context of inflation at 10.1% and a cut in funding of 1.5 million, the real cut is much bigger than 1.5 million. The other funding source, of course, that the council receives is it retains 50% of all business rate income that's generated in the city, which means it also retains 50% of any growth in business rate income that arises between one year and the next. Business rate retention is extremely complex, but there's an underlying increase in business rates of 5.5 million, or 9.9%. Business rates is actually linked to inflation. It's linked to CPI, Consumer Price Index, that is, the CPI level in September. So September was 10.1. You can see that our rise is 9.9. So part of it is to do with price, and there's a little drop off because of other matters, mainly the revaluation that is due to come in from April this coming year. We didn't receive an indicative settlement for the following year, so we don't know yet what our settlement will be for 24-25, although government did produce a policy paper called Local Government Finance Policy Statement. So that did set out some parameters. It set out, for example, that in 24-25, the council tax thresholds will be the same again as they are this year. Now, the council tax thresholds for this year, you will recall, have been increased. Usually, the cap for general purposes is 1.99. That was raised, or is 2%. That was raised to 3%. The adult social care precept is usually 1% on the tax. That was raised to 2%. So the government are suggesting, or in their policy paper, they're stating that those, if you like, elevated levels of council tax thresholds will continue for 24-25 as well. It also announced additional funding in social care as well, on top of the additional funding in the current year. So we've got a reasonable degree of certainty of continued increased funding for social care also. So in terms of, so that gives you an indication of what's happened in terms of funding that sit around the local government finance settlement. It's 6.4 million in grant, £5.5 million in retained business rates. In terms of, we've moved to council tax, which is the other source of funding of the. Mark?
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Chair? The 6.4 million, is that, do you know the percentage increase that is off the top of your head?
It is, I'd have to look back at it because it's complicated the way that they've done it, because they've changed the funding streams around. So in order to do a like-for-like comparison, I have to look back. I've probably got it here, and I'll probably be able to give it to you at the end of the session, if that's okay.
Thanks, yeah.
Okay. So if we turn to council tax, obviously the government set the referendum threshold for general purposes at 3%, but obviously in context we've got inflation running at 10.1%, as I've mentioned. The social care precept was set at 2%, as I've also mentioned. You will probably also have heard that the limit for Police and Crime Commissioner, that's a £15 increase in council tax, and the limit for the Fire and Rescue Authority is a £5 increase. On the next slide, I'll show you what that means in terms of the council, a Portsmouth residents' council tax, and what it means in overall terms. And as I've alluded to earlier on, the big risk going forward, and the big risk for the council's forecast, which is why I keep talking about our forecast could be out by plus or minus 5 million, or one of the big risks, is the expectation that there'll be an overhaul of local government funding in 25-26. Comes in two different categories. One, it's the grant, it's the grant funding that's distributed, and that is rolled up with business rates. But it relates to about £60 million worth of funding overall, or £63.9 million worth of funding overall. So that will be completely revisited, revised, and the council may be a winner out of that, or it may be a loser. We don't know the answer. And consultations that have been provided in the past are so far out of date now that the government would have to reconsult on any new proposition for changing the way that local government grant funding is distributed.
Chris, so is that the same grant funding as was increased 6.4 this year, or is
it's related to that, but it
roughly
won't.
the same, or is it just because I was thinking of Mark's question about percentage? Well, 63.9 and 6.4 is about 10%, but maybe there's more we actually get in grant funding.
Yeah, it's broadly that figure. It is broadly that figure. But to do it accurate, to do it accurately, I would have to look at it a bit more closely.
Probably a little under 10%.
But around about 10% is probably where the answer will be. But those two are related, yeah. And then we have the business rate retention scheme, which, as I've said, that's the scheme that allows you to keep 50% of all the business rate growth that originates in the city or has been generated in the city. Now, what will happen is that there will be this thing called a reset. So every local authority that has generated additional business rates, that will all be taken back. So, and for the Portsmouth, that's £11 million. So my plus or minus 5 million is in that context. £11 million will be drawn back. What government have said, though, is that all of the business rate growth will remain in the local government system and it will be redistributed, but it will be redistributed on a needs basis, not on the basis of how it was generated. So at the moment it's kept on the basis of where it was generated. It all gets sucked back up to the centre and then it gets redistributed on a needs basis, and actually what it does is it goes through that thing called the Fair Funding Review, which is the other part of the local government overhaul of funding that I mentioned just now. So, and again, the council may or may not, may be a winner or may be a loser. Our estimates are that, and what we've planned for in the forecast, is the council will probably lose about £1.5 million worth of funding. So 11 million is taken back and 9.5 million is given back. Excuse me. If we take the council tax in particular, I won't dwell on this. I've mentioned already that the council is already a low taxing authority. The average council tax for a band B presently is £1,221.47 per annum, and around about 57% of all households pay the full tax. All other households will be in receipt of some form of either single person discount, some other exemption, or maybe in receipt of local council tax support because of their income levels. So the council tax proposal within the papers that you will have to consider, as I've mentioned, will be 2.99% increase for general purposes and a 2% increase for adult social care, in total amounting to 4.99%. Overall, that raises £4.5 million. Obviously, set in the context earlier on, as I was talking, we started our position from a budget gap of 24 million. And of that 4.5 million, 1.8 million goes direct to adult social care because it's raised through the adult social care precept. On top of that, there is an additional £400,000 worth of council tax income that will arise as a consequence of effectively an increase in the number of properties in the city that are paying council tax. So in overall terms, the council tax income will rise by 4.9 million. If we turn that into the residents' council tax bill, what we expect to see is that Portsmouth will increase their council tax by 4.99%. The Police and Crime Commissioner, their £15 equates to a 6.34% increase. The Fire Authority's £5 equates to a 6.63% increase, and therefore overall, the overall increase, if all of those council tax resolutions pass, will be a 5.23% increase for the Portsmouth resident.
Chris, could I just ask on the police and the fire authority? Clearly, that's more than the 3%. So they've got the authority. They're not bound by the restrictions that government put in. And could they have gone higher?
Their thresholds are in pounds as opposed to percentages. So the threshold, the limit for police was £15, and that's what we understand they will put forward as their council tax proposal. And the limit for fire was £5, so it wasn't a percentage, it was an absolute amount. And we understand that they will be putting forward the £5 increase too. So the budget proposals themselves, as I've mentioned earlier on, there's savings proposals amounting to £2 million. So in the budget papers there, they are contained in Appendix C. The original forecast, as I mentioned earlier on, was that we didn't anticipate any savings at all until we started to experience those elevated levels of inflation and demand throughout the year. So in order to accommodate what was originally a £24 million budget gap, £2 million was required in order to get to a balanced position in combination with the other reliefs that the council has received through additional funding from government that I've mentioned through the settlement, the additional funding through business rates that I've mentioned, and also some use of council's COVID contingency, because some of those budget pressures were genuinely related to COVID. And finally, through the management or mitigation of budget pressures that the council was experiencing, many of which we are making some budget provision for in the council's contingency, again, which I'll come to as I go through the presentation. So the budget itself, you'll start to see the stark impact of inflation now. So there's a total increase. If you looked at the total net expenditure of last year's or the current year's budget that was originally set, and the total net expenditure of the coming year's budget as proposed, the difference is £28.1 million, which is I think that's a 16% overall 16% increase in total. So that's partly inflation, obviously, and it's partly demand. If we look at some of the breakdown of that, so it's a big chunk is for adult social care, 7.4 million, and a large proportion of that being the national living wage, which adult social care pay across to the care providers for providing care packages in residential homes, and some of this is for domiciliary care as well. Children's social care, 6.1 million, and large elements of that relate to home to school transport and the cost of placements, which is actually a high profile national issue at the moment too. Inflation generally across all other services, excluding adults and children's, that is a cost of 8.1 million across all other council services, and it averages out at about 9.6%. And there's a number of other technical adjustments which mainly relate to business rates, but over time are financially neutral. And there's council savings proposed of £2 million. There's no revenue contribution to capital in the proposal for 23-24, simply unaffordable. In order to accommodate all of the other budget pressures, as is usual, the council often makes a revenue contribution to capital, but it's not been affordable in the coming financial year.
I thought I read somewhere in the report, and correct me if I'm just wrong, about a £750,000, so £700,000 contribution to capital. Was that not this year?
That's planned in the current year's budget. This is the proposal for next financial year. Yeah.
Chris, sorry, obviously the biggest chunk on there is other, and it says smoothing of business rates. What does that actually mean?
I might lose you in the technicality, but ultimately what has happened in the past is you probably know that we've received a lot of business rate reliefs. So there's been the extended retail relief. So lots of businesses out there that are in retail and leisure have had relief on their business rates, i.e. 50% relief for part of the year, 100% relief for the other part of the year, and so on and so forth. Ordinarily, what happens is, if the government gives any kind of relief, business rate relief, that's money that the council would otherwise have received, because the council receives 50% of all business rates. So if the government then gives a relief, that then would harm the funding for local councils. So what happens is that the amount of money that the council then collects in the year is less than it otherwise would have been. So the government gives us a grant instead to compensate. But the year in which we get the grant and the year in which we experience the loss of business rate income are two different years. So it means we have to do these adjustments between years, but over time they balance each other out. So it might mean, so in this example here, we have got increases in our costs, but we'll get the funding in a different period. We had the funding in the previous year. Don't worry, it gives the accountants a bit of a headache as well, because there's lots of these schemes. It's not just that scheme. We've had the COVID Additional Relief Fund as well, and we've had numerous other schemes prior to that.
Could I ask, Chris, just because it's slightly related, but it's actually sort of to do with the previous slide. As a result of COVID, and you could also, was there an increase in the amount of people getting council tax reliefs, or a change in the amount of collection of council tax? And also, just could you explain who pays for that? Do we bear that cost mostly, or the government, or is it split between us?
So in terms of, I'll do them separately because there's council tax and business rates. In terms of council tax, we have suffered reductions in our collection rates, and to the extent actually that Portsmouth, in terms of unitary councils, has suffered one of the worst. I think it's suffered the second worst reduction in council tax, in-year council tax collection rates. That doesn't mean that you won't recover it at a later date, but the amount of council tax that's billed in the year and then collected in the year is quite substantially down. That then leads to, and you may see it in the budget report, what's called you'll get a deficit on your collection fund, which is where you collect all the money in. You'll get less money in than you thought you were going to get. It then leads you to have a deficit. Any deficits are then shared between all of the preceptors, but the preceptors being the count, i.e., who is it that raises income from the council tax. So roughly, the numbers aren't exactly right there in the report, but roughly speaking, I think it's about 83 or 84% of the council tax is Portsmouth City Council. About 11% of the council tax is the Police and Crime Commissioner, and around 6% I think is the Fire Authority. And then what you do is you share the deficit in that proportion with those other organisations. So the council will take 84% of the deficit, and then that's factored into our council tax income the following year. So the council does suffer if it doesn't collect council tax at the levels that it had planned to.
Do you have a percentage in terms of how much collection rates have dropped or not?
Ultimate collection rates are down about 2%. We think are down about 2%. And obviously, you know that every 1% on the council tax is 900,000, so 2% is about 1.8 million. It's not insignificant. If we have a similar issue in terms of business rates, and businesses don't pay, and businesses, for example, go bust, and our ultimate collection rate drops, then any deficit on that, the council picks up 49%. 1% is picked up by the Fire Authority, and the other 50% is picked up by the government.
And also,
nice and simple.
Yeah, about council tax reliefs. So single person and council tax benefit. Who picks up the tab for that, and has that gone up?
So the council picks up the tab for council tax discounts in the same way as there is any deficit. So it's picked up in those proportions. So 84% Portsmouth Council, roughly 11% the Police and Crime. I've got the percentages in the report actually. I just can't remember them off the top of my head. And around about 6% for fire. But yeah, so what happens is if local council tax support caseloads go up, So there are more people that are not having to pay as much council tax. That's less council tax income for Portsmouth and less funding for council services. Same for single person discounts and exemptions.
And has that gone up during COVID?
Single person, interestingly, local council tax support caseloads did not go up during COVID. They actually went down. They're starting to rise now. Single person discounts have been gently rising, but you tend to find that as and when we do a single person discount review, they then fall, and then they creep up over time, and then they fall when we do a review, and it's because of the identification of people that are
Be charitable and say in new relationships, or have forgotten to change it.
when we do an exercise to identify, we usually write to people where we think that they are no longer entitled to a single person discount, and suddenly single person discounts start to drop.
Chris, could I just ask you, on inflation, you have a figure of 9.6. Now that's gone down a bit since, I think it was 10 earlier on that was mentioned. All the indications or all the predictions are that in fact the Prime Minister has said that inflation will be halved. I think that was from 10% so we're talking about 5%. By the end of this year, I think, if I remember, is what his prediction is, right? How does that then manifest itself? Because that will mean savings then in all categories, including adult social care and children's social services, who presumably have been allowed the full this 9.6, Chris, right? So it could be, if we're down to 5%, we will have, and I use this word loosely, millions to play with.
I wish. So, yeah, I think that the way that we budget, Leo, is that if you imagine that the budget that we have for the current year is supposed to be sufficient for our costs. So if inflation, then when we set the budget for next year, we've got to uprate it by the inflation that we've really experienced this year. So it's almost like there's a time lag. So you, based on what your inflation is this year, you uplift it to bring your budget back into sufficiency for the following year. So that we've uplifted broadly by 9.6%. Inflation is running at 10.1, but our inflation is not 10.1. Our inflation is 9.6, because a large part of our inflation is our staff costs, and obviously we are affected by energy and so forth, which is part of the basket of indicators, the consumer price index. So our inflation is 9.6%. We've uplifted budgets by 9.6% because that's what they've effectively suffered in terms of the erosion of the spending power. Now, when inflation is then predicted to rise next year, on average, it's predicted to rise by the OBR, which I think is what the Prime Minister has also effectively suggested, by 5.5% on average next year. It starts high and it ends low, but the average is 5.5. So when we do our forecast next year and we do our budget for next year, we'll be uplifting budgets by a further 5.5%. So inflation is it's rising prices on top of rising prices on top of rising prices. So the 5.5% is actually on top of the 9.6%. Did that make sense?
I think so, but when I wake up, it might sink in. It's just that it seems a strange figure. That's all 9.6. We didn't pluck it from somewhere, did we, Chris? Was it given to us on a plate?
No, we didn't pluck it from somewhere. So in reality, what we've got inflation in the current year. Let's take an example. Pay was higher than we'd budgeted for, and then pay will be high next year as well. So we've said, what's happened to pay between this year and next year? We know what that level of inflation is. For us, it was just under 7%. We've looked at every other category of expenditure and said, how much is energy going up? How much are other supplies and services going up? How much is so? And then we relate that to each of the council's budget lines, so that overall we can come up with a composite rate of inflation, and that composite rate is 9.6%.
And then the next 5% is on top of that again. So you can't ever take it back. It's like the
Well, yeah, because inflation is about the rate at which prices rise. If it went negative, then we'd be saying we'd be taking money back from services. But all the time it's positive, you're adding money because prices are
acceleration,
rising.
not speed.
Yeah.
On this slide, I had one more question because we're sort of doing questions as we go along. That's all right, Chris. The contingency is 15 million in this year's budget, and it's 12 or 13 in next year, and then it drops a fair amount after that. Is that money that's actually allocated? So is that actual budgeted money that then you might get some back of if the contingencies don't arise, or is it money which, has to be, well, isn't sort of theoretical? You see what I mean?
Okay, it's obviously it's real money in the budget, but it's not specifically allocated to individual costs. So we've got a range of risks, and if we added up our worst case scenario of all of those range of risks, it would add up to way in excess of 15 million. So we go through an exercise where we try to quantify what do we think the likely outcome of all of those financial risks are. So we do a bit of a probability work, and obviously some of those risks will come to pass, some of them won't. Some of them will be higher than we thought, some of them will be lower than we thought. So we don't actually allocate it and embed it within council budgets, service budgets, until we actually know what it is. So we have money in the contingency for any in-year risks. If those in-year risks come to fruition and become an ongoing cost, then we would have to add that to our forecast in the future, and it would then form part of savings that we need to make because we would start to go into budget deficit. If we don't need all of the contingency that is in the year, often that's where we say we didn't need all of the contingency. The council now has a forecast underspend, and the council can then utilise that money in general to put towards its capital programme. That's because it's of a one-off nature. So that's usually why there are revenue contributions to the capital programme, because it's the underutilisation of the contingency in the main.
I understand. And just to clarify what you said, it was last year that there was a high contingency, then this year was a high contingency, and next year the contingency is back down to...
It was over 18 million in, I say last year, current year, dropping to 15 million next year. The core level of budget that we have in the contingency is just under 5 million. And anything over and above that is for one-off type items that we think will drop out over time. They'll be of a one-off nature. So you've mentioned, obviously, we've got a contingency of 15.1 million for next year, and that is in large part to accommodate the risks that I've set out on the slide there, which are, we're still in an environment of volatile inflation and volatile demand. We don't know exactly how that's going to play out, but all of our budgets are based on the best intelligence around at the moment and the forecast from the Office for Budget Responsibility in the Treasury. We're going into a new business rate regime. There's a new business rate listing, so the revaluation has taken place. What we don't know is how many businesses will appeal against their new rating valuation and how many of those will be successful. So that's always a risk when there's a new rating, when there's a new revaluation. And as you mentioned earlier, Chair, we've got continuing risks about the collection of council tax and the collection of business rates in a cost of living crisis environment. So getting towards the end, this is a very highly summarised forecast of what we think the next 3 years looks like. So there's crystal ball gazing in here, numbers of assumptions, and as I've said, we do seek to base our assumptions on the best information that's around. So our best estimates as we look 3 years forward at that 3 years worth of inflation will probably cost around 12 million for the council. We're still anticipating further pressures around adults and children's social care, some of which will be funded by government, and you'll come to see that in a second. I mentioned earlier on about the overhaul of the local government funding system, and we anticipate that we may be a loser of about 1.5 million out of that, so that's the Fair Funding and Business Rate Retention Scheme. We're actually anticipating over the period that we'll have a reduction in business rates, because if we follow the OBR's forecasts for inflation, inflation averages out at 5.5% next year. The year after, it averages out at just below 0, and the year after that, it's -1%. And because business rates are linked to inflation, then we obviously follow that through. There are a number of technical savings or other net savings here, and actually, Chair, you mentioned them. The reduction in the anticipated level of the council's contingency is one of the main reasons why we're saying other net savings of 6.4 million. Increase in government grants of 4.5 million. That is largely what we anticipate we will get next year for social care. And council tax increases, the assumption being that the council will tax at the referendum threshold, so tax in 24-25 at 4.99% and then dropping down to 2.99% in the 2 years thereafter. If we push all of that through our financial forecasting, we end up with a broadly balanced position. Obviously, considerable risk associated with that. As I've mentioned, we haven't got perfect foresight on what inflation and demand will be, and we haven't got perfect foresight on how we'll fare in the overhaul of the local government funding system, particularly as we are exposed to £11 million worth of business rate growth that will be taken away and then given back by some other allocation methodology. So that takes us to the end of the revenue part of the budget proposal and moves us into the capital programme. So what I'm about to talk to you about now is the new starts. So this is contained within, this is all contained within Appendix D of the report, and Appendix D is in 3 parts, which I'll explain. But broadly, the council, there's a capital strategy within the report as well, and that's a capital strategy that comes to the council the headlines of the capital strategy are in the budget report. A discrete document called the capital strategy will come to the March council meeting, and it will set out that the overall strategy is really about making sure the council adheres to its statutory obligations. It provides capital investment appropriately in order to deliver the sustainability of current services, and they're largely statutory services in any event. Enhancing the environment and regeneration and clean economic growth are the features of the overall capital strategy. The resources available, as I mentioned earlier on, new capital resources are 61.3 million. It's actually the 15.3 million of corporate capital resources. So corporate capital resources generally are those resources that can be used freely for any purpose. But that actually will enable a degree of borrowing on certain schemes. That's estimated at 22.9 million. When it comes to borrowing in the capital programme, you will note that there are a number of schemes in there that are proposed to be funded from borrowing, but what you're being asked for is a decision in principle. It's a decision in principle that in the event that a proper business case viable with an accompanying financial evaluation and appraisal that says that this capital scheme is capable of generating either savings or income sufficient to cover the debt costs associated with its borrowing, if that pans out okay and is net positive, then you're asked in principle to agree the capital schemes that are put forward. And then there's some revenue and reserves and contributions within there as well. To be fair, most of that is external grant, but it's specific grant, i.e. it's got terms and conditions attached. And most of the 23.1 million there is related to a single capital scheme that's proposed in the programme that's related to shore power, and the hope that we'll be able to that we will be successful in a bid to government for £20 million. So if we turn the funding side, the 61.3 million into actual capital investment or new capital schemes, there's three broad categories you could seek to package this up as. That 61.3 broadly breaks down as to just under 40 million for environmental initiatives and what I've described as clean economic growth. Now, obviously, that's shore power is contained within that heading. Economic growth, 4.7 million. That's much of that really relates to the city centre north regeneration or new city centre. There's around £7.8 million worth of what we call essential maintenance and essential equipment, actually, in order to maintain our current operational buildings, so the buildings from which council services are provided, whether they be administrative or whether they be direct service provision. And there's a 1.3 million allocation for transport. I've put some of the proposals in this slide, some of the larger proposals, or certainly larger in financial terms, that feature within those categories that I've just mentioned. So shore power I've mentioned. The anaerobic digestion plant, that's already in the capital programme, but there's a request in here for additional borrowing for that still financially viable scheme. Twin stream recycling as a consequence of the Environment Act that's come through. So that's recycling of plastics, basically. Mountbatten Centre roof at 6.8 million. Some of that money was already set aside. It's been set aside in a sinking fund over many, many years, but it requires an additional 1.8 million, but 6.8 million is the total cost of the scheme. Landlord's maintenance 1.4. That is only for the highest risk items, almost exclusively fire risk assessment work and other health and safety related work. And also one of the reasons why the council holds a contingency, just in case other costs arise that need to be funded. Replacement border control post, again, this is one of the decisions in principle that is proposed in the report. So long as the income generated from it would more than satisfy the additional debt costs, then that's a decision in principle for the council. That would obviously then leave the existing border control post available for alternative use. Obviously some strings attached to that as well, because it's tied up with a government agreement, because government funded the vast majority of it, albeit it left the council with a £5.6 million bill to complete it. And special educational needs places as well. Inevitably, and this is just something to be mindful of, and it's something to be mindful of when developing strategies, not just a capital strategy, but also what you might consider as your asset management strategy. And should you really be thinking about, for example, an asset rationalisation? Because the more assets that you've got, the more it will drain your capital resources, which means it's capital resources that you can't otherwise allocate to other of your needs, obligations, priorities and aspirations. There'll always be a huge gap between aspirations and obligations and the funding that's available. Obviously, we'll always do the best that we can to bid for external funding, but inevitably there will be a gap, and we need to you have to seriously think about how you fund that gap. One of the reasons that we always also mention that if there are any underspendings that are available, use it to help fund your capital aspirations and make a revenue contribution to capital. And capital can be quite important in terms of your overall financial strategy, because it can help you stimulate your funding base, i.e. through council tax and business rates, which then is that kind of virtuous circle of you start to have more funding for the delivery of council services, and you raise overall prosperity in the city as well. So I'll conclude quickly. £2 million worth of savings within the proposal. It's a balanced budget. It's very well aligned to the council's medium-term financial strategy and to the results of the budget consultation. Key issues for us, or key risks, really revolve around inflation and demand volatility next year, obviously in future years as well, but in particular next year, and it's usually adults and children's social care that feel the brunt of that. Future funding is very, very uncertain, and reform, I call it reform, may or even may not happen because it's planned for the new Parliament. But in having said all that, the council's financial health is sound. It's got itself into a position where it has a structurally balanced budget, basically where its in-year spending matches its in-year income, and I don't think there are too many local authorities that could make the same claim. That's all from me.
Thank you very much, Chris. Very, very thorough and comprehensive. Further questions from the panel? Does anyone have any further questions that they would like to ask Chris about the budget? Councillor Heaney.
Could I ask some questions about the indicative savings? Just a couple of things. One slightly odd one. I noticed that we've got one on page 85 which talks about charging £15 for delivery of replacement black bins. And looking at the figure, I calculated that would be 1,666 bins to be replaced. Is that a rather... And I mean, it's not a large sum of money, but it seems a rather large number of bins that have to be replaced. We're confident we're going to meet that figure.
We have looked at it, yeah. We've. It's one of those things that, you know, when we see it for the first time as well, we think that seems like a large number of bins as well. And where are all these bins going? But it's based on our history. I'll get the breakdown for you anyway. I don't think you're the only person that's asked that question.
No, I suspected I wasn't, but I just wonder where all the bins go. I had a more serious one. There's one related to page 87, which talks about health, wellbeing, social care. It talks review of high-cost placements in adult services. It says £200,000, but there's no direct impact on service users. Is that because we're talking about, you know, a couple of placements here, and they're very, very high cost, like £100,000 each, or how does it come that there's no impact on service users if we're saving £200,000 if it's not high cost ones? Because if it's lots of smaller cost ones, I think there might be an impact on service users.
Yeah, it's part of the annual routine of adult social care, which they always go through. So once care packages get to a certain threshold, it becomes quite obvious that the care package is not just about personal care, it's also about health needs. And once you start to investigate exactly what a package is providing, if it's providing healthcare needs, that becomes an NHS cost. Sometimes it's routed then through what's called continuing healthcare, and then there's a sharing arrangement of the cost between the council and the NHS, where the NHS pick up the healthcare related costs and the council pick up the social care related costs. So that's why there's no impact. The care package wouldn't change necessarily, but who pays for it would. Yeah.
I have just two others I want to raise. One was on the previous page, page 85. It talks about maximising housing benefit support to care leavers, and it says no impact, £80,000. So it's a slightly strange one, because normally one would want to maximise the benefit support to care leavers in any circumstance, and I'm just thinking that as there have been arguments about what housing benefit pays for in the past in relation to people, I'm just interested to know how have we missed something in the past, or are there new rules which allow people to get more as a result of that?
I don't think it's about new rules. I think it's about a greater focus. So there may have been opportunities in the past, don't know, but we certainly believe there's an opportunity now. Yep.
Final question for me was in relation to the New Start schemes on available capital resources, page 89. It talks about the City Council taking over the green waste service from Biffa. And this in order to take over the service, the Council also needs to provide residents with a 240 litre brown bin. Well, I don't know about you, but every resident has already got a brown bin, so aren't we just buying them off Biffa? Do we need a new one? And is it going to cost us £100,000?
That's exactly it. They're not the council's bins. They're Biffa's bins. And the council either needs to re-provide or purchase from Biffa. Yeah.
Purchase from Biffa probably sounds sensible. Okay.
Any other questions, other members? I have one or two more. I was wondering about one or two of the lines in the capital programme, and maybe you're not able to specifically answer, and I might have to ask Cabinet, but one thing we wondered is about the Cisco Meraki infrastructure refresh within the civic offices costing around £300,000, when there's yet to be a decision made about the future of the civic offices and whether or not we're staying there and whether or not the building's even staying there. Is that definitely something that, do you know if that has to be installed as a matter of urgency, or why it appears this year in the capital programme?
Yeah, because those devices, as I understand it, once they reach their designated life expiry, they just turn off. To me, it sounded a bit like the Millennium Bug. They have a limited time life, and I think once they reach 10 years old, they switch off, and they're effectively redundant. The new equipment that is proposed is able to be relocated. So even if it's purchased, it's not wasted because they can be taken out and replaced in a new facility. But it will still take a few years for the relocation from the civic offices to a new facility, and without the wireless access points, there'll be no Wi-Fi connectivity within the civic or the outstations.
That makes sense. If there is a matter of urgency, then there is. I had a question about the BMX park in Baffins. Half the cost is, so the capital contribution is 65. The total cost is 125. Do you know where the other 60 is coming from for it?
My recollection is it's still ward funding.
Okay, that would make sense.
Or it's certainly community funding. It's certainly community. It's not council funding. It's certainly community funding.
It's not a grant either, but
sorry,
it's not a government grant.
No.
Okay, so I think some sort of community. And then lastly, Farlington playing fields are being acquired for £500,000. Do we know why we're acquiring playing fields in Farlington?
It would be a strategic acquisition to protect the site. That doesn't mean to say that it would be used for an alternative purpose, but to protect the site for its existing purpose.
What kind of? I mean, obviously that means then it potentially isn't profit making, but just an expenditure of capital that then the council has that land on its books. Yeah. So just an asset acquisition.
It could have a revenue stream attached to it.
Yeah. Yes, if it was being used by community groups, they paid pitch fees or.
Yeah, there are other alternative uses for it that could generate an income stream.
Okay. Because Lizzie, just because of something you said when doing the report on the slide on aspirations and obligations, do you think that council has unusually large asset book compared to other authorities. You sort of, in a way, suggested we might need to be careful and prioritise, and I was wondering if that's if we might have a lot of assets relative to other councils.
Within the budget report itself, there's a plan next year to do an asset management strategy. So that will look at the operational estate of the council, look at what the council's objectives and priorities are, whether we've got the right assets for the delivery of our priorities, whether those assets are sufficient in terms of their condition, whether they perform properly, what their life cycle liabilities would be, so that there can be proper judgments about the extent to which you retain or re-provide those assets, which is, I think, is an important point when you consider that the council's capital funding resources will never match the council's aspiration. And if you want to get closer to your aspiration, you probably ought to seek to manage the drain on your capital resources by assets that may no longer meet the council's needs.
Are there any assets which stand out as costing us a particularly large amount of money, or do you mean it may be a larger number of assets costing us a small amount of money?
I think that's the purpose of the work.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that work is already planned, so.
It is, yeah. There's reference in the budget report about funding from the MTRS reserve. So there's a section in there that talks about funding that work next financial year.
Second to last question. The slide on the next 3 years, are there still significant changes to the way adult social care is working and funding planned down the road now? I admit I'll have lost slightly track of national policy, but there is a significant change to discharge coming down the road. Is that all accounted for in our ongoing plan?
It's actually one of the risks. So you mentioned to me, we spoke earlier on about the level of the council's contingency. There will be obligations on adult social care, and I don't think we've quite seen them yet, because some of the funding for next year is called ASC discharge funding, but we have yet to see what the terms and conditions of that funding are and what the obligations on the council are in terms of supporting that discharge will be. So it is one of the financial risks that we've captured within the council's contingency and in the council's future forecasts.
And then just finally on the council tax point, so what you've accounted for in the forward strategy, so this year and so in next year's budget and the budget the year after, so 24-25, you've accounted for 5% increases, and then the 2 years after that 3% increases, you say in total? Yes. Do we know what the total effect would be after the fourth year on a Band B resident?
Well, I can work it out, and broadly it would, I think, a 5% increase is 70 pence a week. It's in the presentation, isn't it? Yeah, so it's £1.17 for a 5% per week for a 5% increase. So it would be a similar amount for the next 5% next year. Then it would drop by 3/5. something like that, yeah.
Around £200 plus the amount of the... Sorry, 60 quid, 60 quid, 40 quid, 40 quid-ish, plus the money that the Police and Crime and the Hampshire Fire Authority take.
Yeah, we don't know what
Yeah.
we don't forecast theirs forward. That's for their budget,
Yeah.
not for ours.
But the overall total that a resident looking at after 4 years could be quite significant, depending on how their income rises in that time.
Yeah, but if you look back in history, you will probably see that council tax increases have been capped at lower than inflation and often lower than wage rises. If we were to take this year, for example, the benefit cap has increased by 10.1%. The national living wage has increased by 9.7%. The council tax has increased by 4.99%.
Yeah. Any other? Yeah. Thank you. I take the point. I could reserve it for a comment in a second. What I was going to say. Any other questions? No. Thank you very much, Chris, again, for answering all those questions. Are there any comments that the panel wish to pass on to Cabinet? I've already noted down our thanks to Chris Ward and team and finance team for the extremely hard work in preparing the budget in difficult circumstances, and to all officers for their continued hard work on behalf of the Council in difficult circumstances. Do we have any thoughts, comments, anything else we wish to say? Councillor Heaney?
Well, I will make a brief comment. I mean, obviously, we've only seen the papers this week. We've only had a chance to go through them in any detail just recently. So it's quite difficult for us as members to make any detailed comments to the Cabinet. It's essentially a information exercise rather than an opportunity for us to make any detailed comments. Obviously, you know, the budget process we have is the budget process we have. It's possible to do it in different ways, but that's down to the administration to decide whether they want to have a more open budget process, which allows more contribution from members. So I think at this moment, I think we may want to reserve our views to what we may wish to put forward at Council. I'm sure we will all, in different groups, have some views about what we might want to do on that. So I don't think there's a lot we can really say at the moment. I see it's not from my perspective.
Absolutely. I take the point, and obviously as well our role in scrutiny is a higher level, and to some degree not to get caught up in the politics of it. And certainly this budget is clearly one, thanks to Chris and officers and the administration, clearly one which keeps the Council in a safe financial position. And from the point of view of scrutiny, I don't have any concerns or issues about it at this time. It makes proper contingencies and therefore is sound planning in that sense. Councillor Madden, did you have...
Yeah, just to say, I mean, clearly we were here for a presentation from Chris, which I've partly seen before anyway. I would just add about not only getting this budget together along with the administration, but also the professionalism of Chris and his team. And the objectivity that you've always brought into it, I have to say. I have tried in the past as leader of the council to try to get bits of information of what others are thinking, and it's a stone wall, and rightly so. And sometimes I've just tested to see if I would get snippets of information. And it's right that, you know, that we will have a discussion on the 28th, possibly one of the cabinet prior to that when members concerned. But I think it's very good that we've got the budget together. It's a bit later this year than would normally be when we actually discuss it, but there we are. I think the panic for some people, and maybe I've overused the word, was going along thinking, you know, we don't have to make any savings this year, and then suddenly finding that 2 million. We've had to find more in the past, and that clearly shows in some of the slides, but nevertheless, halfway through the year or whenever it was, having to find 2 million savings was not an easy thing to do, frankly, right? But nevertheless, just thank you again, Chris, and your team for all your professionalism.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for my part, I do hope that taking a longer, medium-term view of it, I recognise that we would recognise as a council that we're turning to the residents to cover increased costs, and those costs are not the fault of this council, but we are, and you know, Band B may be the average, but as we know, 57% of our households don't necessarily pay full council tax, which might, you know, it means that the contribution being made by bands above that is significant, and their rises are more significant in proportion, well, not in proportion, as a percentage they're the same, but the total amount of money they're handing over to the council each year is rising significantly, and will over 4 years represent quite a significant change in the amount of council tax people pay. You know, hopefully wages rise in that time, but if they don't, I do think as council we do need to think carefully. I think clearly as opposition councillors we don't want to do irresponsible things that would harm frontline services, especially in social care, adult social care, children's social care, but those budgets do increase substantially over the next in the projections over the next few years, and that is obviously a concern for this council and a concern for the government, and I don't think there's any denying that there's concerns this council would want to pass on to the government around social care. The amount of money being spent on unaccompanied minors leaving children's social care, so the ongoing cost you have until they're 25 is very substantial over the next few years. So I do think there are significant pressures that you know require our attention, and I think the looking at our asset portfolio and prioritising what we really want to do in our capital strategy, I think is going to be important going forward as well. So I'm pleased we're doing that in the coming year. Those would be my thoughts on the budget, but I don't need to record those in a formal comment to Cabinet. I'm sure Cabinet will consider those issues carefully anyway. So yeah, in terms of, we don't need to make a formal decision, but we would like to pass on our thanks to Chris Ward and team for their professionalism and objectivity.
Could I quickly thank you as well for the all-member briefings that were put on? They were really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, and yeah, for all the slides and presentations and briefings that you've done over the last couple of weeks on this. So we thank you. Thanks very much to Chris Ward and team and all the officers for their hard work, their professionalism and objectivity. And we passed the budget on to the Cabinet for their consideration, reserving political comments for the council meeting itself. Councillor Ashmore.
Yeah, I also wanted to say individually thanks to Chris and echo what everyone's been saying here about the process. You know, you've had the savings, you know, suddenly surprised on us kind of thing, but to come up with this and to have all those all-member briefings and to have all the things that you've gone through today, and some of it's obviously sounds like grim reading at the time, but you know, something like 2/3 of UK councils are also looking to do their maximum council tax rise. It shows you it's outside forces. It's not our fault. It's not the residents' faults. It's stuff that, you know, has just happened on us. But I also want to, when it comes to the budget consultation, the service priorities, you know, the top three, one of them is ensuring older people and vulnerable adults are looked after, and also keeping children safe, families together. I think, you know, thanks to the people of Portsmouth who responded, they've obviously got that heart and compassion for those services there, so they understand why things are like they are, and they've also got I think the priorities aligned with that, as I think we all have in this room. So yeah, thank you everyone.
Thank you very much. I will close the meeting there. Yeah, I declare the meeting closed at 5 to 5 p.m. Thank you everyone for coming. We'll have a nice weekend.